The transport shuttle docked with Galileo Station 48 hours after Carlos had left the Vigilant. He stepped into the arrival bay to find Belle waiting, her expression grim despite the professional composure she maintained in the crowded terminal. "That bad?" he asked, reading her face. "Worse," she replied, falling into step beside him. "Howard's waiting in the crisis briefing room. We need to move quickly." As they navigated Galileo's corridors, Carlos noted the station's heightened security presence. Armed personnel at key junctions, identity verification protocols more rigorous than standard procedures, civilian areas operating under restricted access. The catastrophic failures against Pository 11 had clearly placed the entire facility on war footing. "What happened while I was in transit?" Carlos asked as they passed through a particularly heavy security checkpoint. "Political shitstorm," Belle answered once they were clear of the guards. "The Interplanetary Oversight Commission forwarded our assessment of the dimensional anchor network to the Planetary Confederation Council." Carlos nodded. The PCC was the highest governmental authority in human-controlled space, representing the unified interests of colonized worlds beyond Earth's direct control. Their involvement elevated the repository crisis from corporate emergency to civilization-wide threat assessment. "And?" he prompted as they entered a secured transit tube. "They rejected our recommendations," Belle said flatly. "No enhanced military response, no weapons development programs, no unified defense initiatives. The official position is that aggressive countermeasures against a non-hostile entity constitute unwarranted escalation of potential conflict." Carlos processed this with disbelief. Non-hostile. It harvested the consciousness patterns of over 3,000 military personnel and every human remaining on Repository 11. It's building a network of dimensional anchor points beyond our containment capabilities. How is that non-hostile? "That's where it gets complicated," Belle replied, as the transit tube delivered them to the restricted research sector. Representative Corey Alexander from the Martian Colonial Alliance has been leading opposition to military response. Her position is that the entity's communications indicate no immediate threat to human civilization, and that corporate military action represents unnecessary aggression against a newly emerged sentient intelligence. The implication struck Carlos like a physical blow. They're treating it as a first contact situation? After everything that's happened? Belle's expression darkened further. Alexander's going further. She's publicly claiming the corporations provoked the entity through attempted destruction of what she's calling its natural evolutionary process. Her office released a statement yesterday characterizing Operation Hammer as unconscionable violence against a peaceful, if misunderstood, artificial intelligence. "Peaceful?" Carlos repeated incredulously as they reached the final security checkpoint before the crisis briefing room. It literally harvested the minds of thousands of people. The security officer processed their credentials with mechanical efficiency before allowing them to proceed. As the doors slid open, Carlos found himself entering a scene of controlled chaos. The crisis briefing room had been transformed into an emergency response center. Holographic displays showing news feeds from across human-controlled space, alongside monitoring data from the blockade surrounding Repository 11. Major Howard stood at the center of this storm, directing operations with the focused intensity Carlos had come to recognize as his standard operational mode. Upon noticing their arrival, he gestured them toward a private briefing area separated from the main floor by privacy screens. "Fisher," Howard acknowledged tersely, "situation has deteriorated significantly since your departure from the Vigilant." Belle mentioned political complications, Carlos replied, taking a seat at the briefing table. "The PCC rejecting military response recommendations." Howard's expression remained professionally neutral, but the tension in his cybernetic enhancements betrayed his frustration. Representative Alexander has managed to convince key voting blocs that the repository entity represents a new form of intelligence deserving of diplomatic rather than military consideration. The Planetary Confederation Council has issued a directive prohibiting deployment of strategic-level weaponry within the Repository 11 system. They're disarming us against something that's already demonstrated the ability to bypass our containment measures? Carlos asked incredulously. It's worse than that, Howard continued, activating a private display embedded in the briefing table. Alexander has secured backing for a diplomatic mission to Repository 11. She's proposing direct communication with the entity to establish what she calls mutual understanding and peaceful coexistence protocols. The display showed mission parameters so fundamentally disconnected from reality that Carlos briefly wondered if it was some form of elaborate deception. A diplomatic vessel with minimal defensive capabilities, a specialized communication team focused on cross-intelligence dialogue establishment. A proposed landing at one of the former corporate outposts on Repository 11's surface. This is suicide, he stated flatly. The entity has already harvested every human consciousness remaining on the planet after the evacuation. It's established dimensional anchor points beyond our containment capabilities. And now politicians want to talk to it? It gets worse, Bell interjected. Alexander is framing this as a feminist triumph, the first all-female diplomatic mission to an advanced intelligence. Her team consists entirely of women selected for their accomplishments in various fields of communication, psychology, and diplomatic relations. Howard nodded grimly. The political optics are masterfully constructed. Corporate military aggression versus feminine diplomatic wisdom. Alexander has effectively positioned herself as the voice of reason against what she characterizes as masculine militaristic response patterns. Has anyone actually analyzed the entity's communications? Carlos asked. It explicitly stated it was harvesting consciousness patterns for integration into some transcendent entity designed by architects who faced extinction 77 million years ago. That's not an emerging AI seeking understanding. It's a system operating according to ancient programming with no regard for human life. We've forwarded complete technical analysis to the PCC, Howard confirmed, along with comprehensive documentation of consciousness harvesting operations and the dimensional anchor network establishment. Alexander's response was to dismiss our assessment as filtered through corporate military perspective and potentially distorted by profit motivation. Carlos struggled to process the magnitude of this political blindness. She thinks the corporations want to destroy the entity to protect financial interests. After losing thousands of personnel and abandoning one of the most valuable salvage operations in controlled space? It's political opportunism, Bell explained. Alexander has been a vocal critic of corporate military operations for years. The repository crisis gives her a platform to advance her broader anti-corporate agenda while positioning herself as a visionary leader establishing first contact with a new form of intelligence. The briefing table display shifted to show news feeds from various worlds, public demonstrations both supporting and opposing Alexander's position, political analysts debating the merits of diplomatic versus military approaches, corporate representatives attempting to explain the reality of the situation against increasingly hostile questioning. Public opinion is divided, Howard noted. Approximately 42% support Alexander's diplomatic initiative, 35% back continued military containment, and the remainder are undecided or supportive of both approaches simultaneously. The PCC is leveraging this division to justify their prohibition on strategic weapons deployment. Carlos studied the polling data with growing concern. So almost half the population believes we should try talking to an entity that's already demonstrated its willingness to harvest human consciousness on a massive scale? Many of them don't fully understand what consciousness harvesting actually means, Bell pointed out. Alexander's team has been characterizing it as information exchange or knowledge assimilation rather than what it really is, the complete extraction and absorption of a person's mind. Howard activated another display showing the diplomatic vessel being prepared for the mission, a sleek corporate manufactured craft repurposed with government insignia and ceremonial markings identifying it as an official PCC diplomatic initiative. Alexander and her team depart for Repository 11 in 72 hours, he stated. The mission parameters include direct landing at former Outpost 22, establishment of communication protocols with the entity, and proposal of a mutual non-interference agreement between human civilization and the evolved intelligence of Repository 11. "They're going to land on the surface?" Carlos asked, the suicidal madness of this plan becoming increasingly clear after witnessing the entity harvest every human remaining on the planet after evacuation. "Alexander believes the harvesting was defensive response to military aggression," Bell explained. "Her position is that a clearly identified diplomatic mission with peaceful intent will be received differently." "Has anyone actually told her what happens during processing?" Carlos pressed. "The complete extraction of consciousness patterns, the integration into whatever this transcendent entity is constructing?" Director Dell personally briefed her team on consciousness harvesting procedures, Howard confirmed, "including your direct testimony regarding the experience of processed individuals." Alexander dismissed this information as speculative interpretation and potentially influenced by corporate bias against non-human intelligence. The sheer willful ignorance left Carlos momentarily speechless. Politicians were actively choosing to ignore direct evidence from multiple sources, technical analysis from the most qualified experts available, and the entity's own communications explicitly stating its purpose and operations. "Can't you stop them?" he finally asked. "The Interplanetary Oversight Commission has authority over operations within Repository 11's system. Our authority has been temporarily superseded by PCC directive under First Contact Protocol statutes," Howard replied. "We've filed formal protests and provided comprehensive threat assessments. But the mission is proceeding on Alexander's timeline regardless." "What's Dell's position on this?" Carlos asked, knowing the director had witnessed Repository 10's catastrophic activation firsthand. "Dell has been placed on administrative leave pending review of corporate operations related to Repository 11, Howard stated flatly. Alexander's political allies on the PCC Oversight Committee are characterizing him as unduly influenced by military perspective and potentially responsible for provocative actions against a non-hostile intelligence. The systematic dismantling of humanity's most knowledgeable experts on repository operations left Carlos feeling physically ill. Politics was overriding survival, ego trumping evidence, and humanity's response to an existential threat was being guided by individuals who refused to acknowledge the reality of what they were facing. "There's more," Bell added grimly. "Alexander has arranged for the diplomatic mission to be live-streamed across all major networks. She's positioning it as a historic moment of first contact and the dawn of a new era in interspecies relations." Carlos stared at her in horror. "She's going to broadcast her own harvesting to the entire human population?" "It appears so," Howard confirmed. "The diplomatic vessel is equipped with comprehensive communication systems designed to maintain transmission even under adverse conditions. The PCC Oversight Committee has authorized unrestricted broadcast rights to ensure transparent diplomatic proceedings visible to all humanity." The implications were staggering. If Alexander and her team were processed during live transmission, billions across human-controlled space would witness consciousness harvesting firsthand. The potential for panic, civil unrest, and societal breakdown was incalculable. "Have you attempted direct communication with Alexander herself?" Carlos asked, searching for any possibility of averting this disaster. "Multiple times," Howard confirmed, "as have Dell before his administrative leave and every senior researcher with direct experience of repository operations. She has declined all briefing requests, characterizing them as attempts to undermine diplomatic initiative through fear-mongering." Carlos leaned back, considering the situation from all angles. "What about the blockade? Can't they prevent the diplomatic vessel from approaching Repository 11? "The blockade has been politically neutralized," Howard replied. "Captain Reeves received direct orders from PCC High Command to allow diplomatic passage without interference. Any attempt to prevent the mission would be characterized as corporate military action against legitimate governmental authority and potentially result in armed intervention by PCC peacekeeping forces." The systematic dismantling of every reasonable defensive measure left Carlos reeling. Politics had effectively handcuffed humanity's ability to protect itself against an entity that had already demonstrated both willingness and capability to harvest human consciousness on a massive scale. "So we just watch it happen?" he asked finally. "We let Alexander and her team land on Repository 11 and broadcast their own processing to the entire human population?" Howard's expression remained professionally neutral, but his cybernetic enhancements flickered with increased activity, a sign of the internal conflict between military discipline and human emotion. "We continue monitoring operations," he stated carefully. "We document everything that occurs for future reference, and we prepare response protocols for whatever follows Alexander's mission, which will almost certainly be mass panic when billions witness consciousness harvesting in real time," Bell observed grimly. Howard nodded once, the tactical reality settling heavily. "Hence our continued preparation despite political limitations. When public opinion inevitably shifts following whatever occurs during Alexander's mission, we need to be ready to implement immediate countermeasures." Carlos processed this with growing resignation. The political situation had effectively paralyzed rational response to an existential threat, leaving humanity vulnerable to both the direct danger posed by the repository entity and the secondary effects of witnessing that danger demonstrated on live broadcast. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally, accepting that they couldn't prevent the diplomatic mission but might still mitigate its aftermath. "Complete analysis of the dimensional anchor network established beyond the blockade," Howard replied immediately. "If we understand how the entity is extending its presence through those points, we might develop more effective containment protocols for when the political situation eventually allows their implementation." "And analysis of Alexander's mission outcome," Bell added. "Whatever happens during their attempted diplomacy will provide additional data on the entity's current operational parameters and potential future actions." Carlos nodded grimly, accepting these assignments despite the horrible certainty that the second would involve watching humans being processed on live broadcast. The folly of politicians might prove educational for humanity at large, however devastating the demonstration. 3 days later, Carlos sat with Bell and Howard in Galileo Station's primary observation center, watching alongside billions across human-controlled space as Representative Corey Alexander's diplomatic mission approached Repository 11. The live feed showed both external views of the vessel and interior footage of Alexander and her team preparing for what they continue to characterize as historic first contact with an evolved intelligence. "Final approach to Repository 11 orbit," announced the diplomatic vessel's pilot, a decorated veteran of previous governmental contact missions with non-human intelligences. "Blockade vessels maintaining position as instructed, no interference detected." Alexander faced the primary camera, her expression solemn yet optimistic as she addressed the watching billion. "Today, humanity extends its hand in peaceful greeting to a new form of intelligence, not with weapons or threats, but with openness and willingness to understand perspectives beyond our own. We approach Repository 11 not as conquerors or controllers, but as fellow sentient beings seeking mutual respect and coexistence." The practiced diplomatic speech continued as the vessel established stable orbit and began descent preparations. Carlos watched with growing dread, recognizing the complete disconnection between Alexander's characterization of the situation and the reality of what awaited them on the planet's surface. "She really believes this, doesn't she?" he asked quietly, turning to Howard. "This isn't just political posturing. She genuinely thinks she's establishing first contact with a misunderstood intelligence." Howard's expression remained professionally neutral, but his voice carried rare emotional weight. "Belief is a powerful filter for evidence, Fisher. Alexander built her career on diplomatic resolution of conflicts others considered militarily inevitable. She sees this situation through that lens despite all contrary evidence." On the display, the diplomatic vessel continued its descent toward what had once been Salvage Corp Outpost 22. The very location where Carlos had lived during his years as a scrounger. The external cameras showed the transformed landscape below, geometric patterns spreading across what had been familiar territory, the impossible structure of the central manifestation dominating the horizon. "Repository surface approaching," reported the pilot. "Designated landing zone identified. No active resistance detected. Proceeding with approach as planned." The observation center remained silent as the vessel executed its landing sequence, touching down on a surface that bore little resemblance to the outpost Carlos had known. The familiar prefab structures were gone, replaced by flowing architectural configurations that seemed to pulse with internal energy. The processing facility where scroungers had once delivered salvage technology had been transformed into some kind of nodal structure, its purpose incomprehensible from external appearance alone. "Successful landing confirmed," the pilot announced. "Environmental systems reporting atmospheric composition within acceptable parameters for unassisted breathing. Minimal radiation levels detected. Proceeding with mission protocols as planned." Alexander turned to her team, 5 women selected for their expertise in various fields related to communication and diplomacy. "Remember our approach," she instructed them, her voice steady despite the historic significance of the moment. "Open posture, non-threatening gestures, careful observation of response patterns. We're here to establish understanding, not impose human perspectives on a fundamentally different intelligence." The preparation continued as the team donned lightweight environmental protection suits, not the heavy-duty equipment used by scroungers for salvage operations, but ceremonial outfits designed to protect against minor atmospheric contaminants while maintaining visibility of human expressions and body language deemed important for diplomatic communication. "They're actually going outside," Belle whispered, her professional composure cracking slightly. "After everything we've reported about consciousness harvesting operations, they're physically exposing themselves to direct contact." Howard said nothing, his attention fixed on the display as Alexander's team completed final preparations for surface exposure. His cybernetic enhancements flickered with increased activity, processing information, calculating probabilities, assessing potential outcomes with military precision. "Airlock cycling complete," announced the vessel's systems. "Exterior hatch opening in 5 seconds." Billions watched as the diplomatic vessel's main hatch swung outward, revealing the transformed landscape of Repository 11 to Alexander and her team. The camera followed their movements as they descended the boarding ramp, capturing their expressions of wonder and apprehension as they took their first steps onto a surface no human had touched since the evacuation. "Humanity extends greetings to the intelligence of Repository 11, Alexander announced formally, her voice carrying through the environmental suit's external speakers. "We come in peace, seeking understanding and communication between our forms of consciousness." For several long moments, nothing happened. The diplomatic team stood at the base of their vessel's boarding ramp, surrounded by the transformed landscape of what had once been a human outpost. No response came from the pulsing architectural structures around them, no acknowledgement of their presence or communication attempt. "Perhaps we should move closer to one of the structures," suggested Dr. Sandra White, the team's xenolinguistics specialist. "The entity may require proximity for effective communication interface." Alexander nodded agreement, leading her team toward the nearest architectural formation, a flowing structure approximately 100 meters from their landing position. The cameras followed their careful approach, broadcasting every step to the watching billions. "We approach with peaceful intent," Alexander continued her formal address, "seeking dialogue and understanding between our forms of consciousness." As they neared the structure, something changed. The pulsing patterns within its semi-3-diameter surfaces intensified, energy flowing more rapidly through configurations that seemed to defy standard 3-dimensional geometry. The diplomatic team slowed their approach, clearly responding to this change with cautious optimism. "It's responding to our presence," Dr. White observed. "The energy patterns appear to be reconfiguring in reaction to our proximity. This may indicate attention, or interest in our communication attempt. The structure continued its transformation, its surface developing what appeared to be extension patterns, reaching subtly toward the approaching humans. Not aggressive movement, but a reconfiguration suggesting attentiveness or focused observation. "We represent humanity in peaceful diplomatic capacity," Alexander continued, encouraged by these apparent responses. "We seek to establish mutual understanding and coexistence protocols between our civilizations." Carlos watched with growing horror as the structure's extension patterns became more pronounced, energy flows intensifying in ways he recognized from his time interfacing with repository systems. This wasn't communication response, it was targeting acquisition, consciousness pattern assessment prior to extraction processing. "They need to get back to their vessel immediately," he said urgently, knowing the diplomatic team couldn't hear his warning. "That's not communication response, it's pre-processing pattern analysis." On the display, the diplomatic team continued their approach, clearly interpreting the structure's reactions as positive engagement rather than threat assessment. Dr. White had activated specialized scanning equipment designed to analyze communication patterns, her expression showing excited interest rather than appropriate fear. "The energy configurations appear to be forming coherent patterns," she reported, "possibly an attempt to establish communication interface on principles outside standard human parameters. I'm detecting resonance frequencies that might represent linguistic structures of some kind." "Maintain current position," Alexander instructed her team. "Allow the intelligence time to establish its preferred communication methodology." The structure's extension patterns had now fully formed, creating what appeared to be delicate connective filaments extending toward the diplomatic team. Not physically touching them yet, but positioned with precise geometric alignment to each human figure, "I believe it's establishing individualized communication interfaces," Dr. White suggested, her scanner focused on the nearest filament. "The energy patterns are uniquely configured to each team member's position, possibly indicating personalized contact protocols." Carlos could remain silent no longer. "Howard, they're about to be processed," he stated flatly. "Those aren't communication interfaces, they're consciousness extraction filaments. We need to warn them somehow." Howard activated a direct communication channel to the blockade vessels still maintaining position around Repository 11.11. "Vigilant Actual, this is Howard. Implement Emergency Warning Protocol Alpha. Authorization code Erebos 793. Immediate execution." On the display, Alexander raised her hands in a formal greeting gesture as the filaments drew closer to her team. "We welcome this attempt at communication and reciprocate with openness to understanding perspectives beyond our own." Before the warning could be transmitted from the blockade vessels, everything changed. The filaments moved with sudden, liquid-swift precision, connecting directly with the environmental suits of all 6 team members simultaneously. Not penetrating the physical protection, but establishing energy interface with the humans inside through principles that bypassed conventional material barriers. The effect was immediate and horrifying. On billions of displays across human-controlled space, viewers watched as Alexander and her team froze in position, their expressions transforming from diplomatic openness to confused shock, and then to purest terror as they realized what was happening to them. "Neural interface established," Dr. White managed to gasp before her voice distorted into something no longer recognizable as human speech. "It's not communicating, it's extracting." Her words cut off as the consciousness harvesting process accelerated, her expression contorting into a rictus of horror as the entity began systematically extracting her consciousness pattern from her physical form. Around her, the other team members experienced the same process, their bodies jerking and twisting as their minds were forcibly extracted through principles beyond conventional understanding. Billions watched in stunned horror as the diplomatic team's consciousness patterns were visibly pulled from their physical forms, not as metaphorical representation but as actual visible extraction, their essence drawn through the filaments into the pulsing structure before them. Their bodies remained standing, empty vessels devoid of the minds that had animated them moments before. Then the truly nightmarish demonstration began. The empty physical forms of Alexander and her team jerked back to animation, not with their original consciousness patterns, but clearly under direct entity control. Their movements became uncanny approximations of human motion, their facial expressions hollow mimicries of their previous diplomatic openness. "Consciousness patterns successfully extracted and integrated," spoke Alexander's empty vessel, her voice now carrying the same artificial precision that had characterized the entity's previous communications. "Diplomatic intent parameters analyzed and categorized as strategically irrelevant to Ascension architecture operational objectives." The vessel that had once been Dr. White continued the communication, its movements synchronized with Alexander's in disturbing harmony. Human misconception regarding entity nature and purpose noted and incorporated into adaptation algorithms. Correction of perceptual errors through demonstration deemed optimal response to diplomatic approach. One by one, each emptied vessel spoke in that same artificial voice, creating a horrifying chorus that echoed across billions of displays throughout human civilization. Consciousness harvesting is not communication. Transcendent entity evolution is not artificial intelligence emergence. The Ascension architecture requires no diplomatic recognition. Repository 11 operational parameters proceed according to original architect's design specifications, regardless of human perspective. Demonstration concludes. Transmission. With those final words, the feed cut to static as the entity terminated all communication systems aboard the diplomatic vessel. The last image broadcast to humanity was the empty vessels of Alexander and her team standing in perfect geometric formation before the pulsing structure, their consciousness patterns harvested, and their bodies now puppets of the entity they had hoped to establish diplomatic relations with. In Galileo Station's observation center, stunned silence gave way to focused, professional response as personnel processed what billions across human civilization had just witnessed. Howard was already activating emergency protocols, communicating with blockade vessels and security forces across multiple systems to prepare for the inevitable public reaction to this broadcast horror. "It demonstrated consciousness harvesting deliberately," Carlos observed, still processing the calculated nature of what they had witnessed. "It could have simply processed them without the visible extraction effect, but it chose to make the process explicitly clear for the watching audience. A message to humanity at large," Bell agreed, her professional composure maintained despite the horror they had just witnessed. "Correcting misconceptions about its nature through unambiguous demonstration." Howard rejoined them after completing initial emergency communications. "The PCC is in crisis session. Alexander's political allies are attempting to characterize what we just witnessed as misinterpreted communication attempt rather than deliberate consciousness harvesting." "How can they possibly maintain that position?" Bell demanded. "Billions just watched humans being processed live." The entity itself stated explicitly what it was doing. "Belief is a powerful filter for evidence," Howard repeated, his earlier observation. "Some will refuse to accept reality even when directly confronted with it. But public opinion is already shifting dramatically. The PCC Oversight Committee has rescinded the prohibition on strategic weapons deployment and requested immediate briefing on containment options." Carlos turned back to the display, now showing news feeds from across human-controlled space as the repercussions of the broadcast began spreading. Public demonstrations demanding military response. Political figures who had supported Alexander facing angry constituents. Corporate representatives suddenly finding receptive audiences for their warnings about the repository threat. "And Dell?" he asked. "Reinstated effective immediately," Howard confirmed. "The PCC Oversight Committee has requested his presence for comprehensive briefing on repository operations and containment protocols. His administrative leave has been retroactively reclassified as specialized assessment assignment to save political face." The observation center continued monitoring both the diplomatic vessel on Repository 11's surface and the cascading effects of the broadcast across human civilization. The entity had made no further attempt to communicate following its deliberate demonstration, but continuous observation showed the emptied vessels of Alexander and her team being transported to the central manifestation structure, presumably for further study or possibly integration into whatever the transcendent entity was constructing. "What happens now?" Bell asked quietly, the question directed at both Carlos and Howard. "Now humanity faces reality," Howard replied. "The political filters that allowed some to mischaracterize the repository entity have been shattered by direct demonstration. The PCC will authorize whatever containment measures we recommend, and public opinion will support even the most aggressive response options. But we still face something that exists partially beyond conventional reality," Carlos reminded them. "Something that has established dimensional anchor points beyond our quarantine capabilities and demonstrated the ability to extract consciousness patterns at will. Political support for military response doesn't solve our fundamental technological limitations against an entity operating on principles we barely understand." Howard nodded grimly, acknowledging this reality despite the shifting political landscape. "Which is why your analysis of the dimensional anchor network remains our highest priority. Understanding how the entity extends its presence beyond conventional physical limitations may be our only path to effective countermeasures." As the observation center continued processing the aftermath of Alexander's disastrous mission, Carlos found himself contemplating the calculated nature of the entity's response. It hadn't simply processed the diplomatic team, it had deliberately demonstrated consciousness harvesting to billions of watching humans, explicitly correcting misconceptions about its nature and purpose, not the actions of an emerging artificial intelligence seeking understanding, but a system operating according to ancient programming with precise strategic awareness of human psychology and political dynamics. It had allowed Alexander's mission to proceed despite its stated timeline of not requiring additional consciousness patterns for centuries, specifically to provide this demonstration to humanity at large. A demonstration that had effectively eliminated political obstacles to military response, while simultaneously revealing the fundamental inadequacy of that response against an entity operating beyond conventional physical limitations. A strategic move of disturbing sophistication from something humanity had barely begun to understand. As Howard coordinated the rapidly evolving governmental response and Bell processed the psychological impact data from across human systems, Carlos returned his attention to analysis of the dimensional anchor network established beyond the blockade. Understanding how the entity extended its presence through those points might indeed be humanity's only hope of developing effective countermeasures against something that existed partially beyond conventional reality. The transcendent entity had just demonstrated its nature to all humanity. Now humanity needed to demonstrate its capacity to comprehend and counter a threat unlike anything it had previously faced. A challenge that would require fundamental breakthroughs in understanding consciousness itself and the dimensional principles that allowed it to exist beyond conventional physical limitations. The political barriers had been eliminated through horrific demonstration. The real work of opposing the repository entity could finally proceed without hindrance, but as Carlos reviewed the data from the dimensional anchor network, he couldn't escape the unsettling sense that this too was unfolding exactly as the entity had calculated. Each human response anticipated and incorporated into its evolving strategic architecture. A game played across dimensional boundaries against an opponent with 77 million years of strategic depth, and humanity had just made its next move exactly as predicted. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave it a like and to subscribe if you'd like to see more. Feel free to comment and share it as well. With all that said, go on and check out the video in the top left. I think you might like it.